Someone said something that actually hurt you last week, and you laughed. Not a real laugh. The other kind. The quick, easy one that comes out before you've even decided to use it, designed to end the conversation before anyone notices your face changed for a second. You said something like, "It's fine, whatever, doesn't matter," and you almost believed yourself while you said it. If any part of that sentence just landed a little too accurately, stay with this, because what's underneath it explains far more than you'd expect. Here's what you didn't notice in that moment, because you're usually too fast for your own observation. Your shoulders had already tightened. Something in your chest had already dropped, just slightly, the way it does right before a feeling arrives that you've already decided you're not going to have. That gap between what your body already knows and what your mouth is already saying is where this entire pattern actually lives. You didn't stop caring. You just got extremely good at looking like you did. Think about how often this actually happens across an ordinary week. A friend cancels plans for the third time, and you say honestly, "It's totally fine." Don't even worry about it, while something small and specific tightens in your chest that you'll only fully notice later alone, replaying the message longer than the situation probably warranted. Someone you were interested in stops texting back as quickly as they used to, and you tell yourself and everyone who asks that you weren't that invested anyway, even as you check your phone slightly more often than you'd ever admit to doing. This is worth understanding properly, because almost everyone assumes indifference is simple. Either you care about something or you don't, like a switch, on or off. But there's a third category almost nobody talks about clearly, a performance of not caring that's so practiced, so automatic, it fools other people completely, and sometimes fools the person doing it too. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. The people who perform this the most convincingly are often, underneath it, the ones who care the most in the entire room. Once you start looking for this pattern, instead of taking calm faces at face value, you may find it's been sitting in plain sight in people you've known for years, the entire time. Let's start with a simple question most people never actually ask themselves. Why would caring feel dangerous enough to hide? It's a strange question to sit with, mostly because caring seems, on its surface, like the safest, most natural thing a person could ever do. Because somewhere along the way, for a specific version of a person, showing that something mattered got punished, not always dramatically, sometimes just quietly, consistently, in small moments that added up over years until the lesson became permanent. A child who cried and got told to toughen up. A teenager whose excitement about something got met with mockery instead of interest. An adult whose visible disappointment once in front of the wrong person got used against them later, weaponized in an argument, brought back up as evidence of weakness. Once that happens enough times, a strategy forms, not consciously chosen, not deliberately built, but real and functional nonetheless. If caring visibly gets you hurt, then hiding the caring becomes the safer option, not because the feeling actually disappears, because the evidence of the feeling disappears, and evidence, to a nervous system trained by repeated pain, is what actually gets punished. There's a specific version of this worth naming because it doesn't always require anything as obvious as mockery or dismissal to take root. Sometimes it formed simply through absence, a household where emotional expression wasn't punished exactly, but was also never met with anything at all. A parent too exhausted, too distracted, or too uncomfortable with feeling in general to respond meaningfully when a child showed real excitement, real disappointment, real fear. A child raised in that kind of quiet, emotional vacancy learns something almost identical to the child who was actively mocked. Showing what you feel doesn't produce connection. It produces nothing, and nothing, repeated often enough, teaches the exact same lesson as active punishment, just delivered more quietly, with less obvious cause to point to later as an adult trying to understand where the pattern actually came from. There's another version worth naming as well, one that develops not from a parent at all, but from an early experience of betrayal, a friend who used a private vulnerability against them later, a partner who mocked something deeply personal once it was shared. A single sharp experience like that, especially during adolescence when identity feels particularly fragile, can sometimes sometimes do more damage to a person's willingness to show real feeling than years of a subtler pattern ever could. One clear, painful lesson, learned at exactly the wrong moment, is often enough to build a defense that lasts for decades afterward. This is the foundation of everything we're going to talk about today. Pretending not to care is rarely about the absence of feeling. It's almost always about managing the risk of that feeling being seen. Keep that distinction close as we go, because it's the single thread that connects everything from here forward. Let's get specific about what this actually looks like, because once you know the signs, you'll start noticing them everywhere, in people you've known for years. The first sign is timing. Someone who genuinely doesn't care about something responds to it immediately, briefly, and moves on without much residue. Someone performing indifference often has a delay. The joke lands, the dismissal comes out fast and smooth, and then, hours later, sometimes days later, something small triggers a reaction that seems wildly disproportionate to whatever's happening in that moment. That delayed reaction is rarely about the small thing that triggered it. It's the original feeling finally finding a crack wide enough to leak through, long after the moment it was supposed to be about has already passed. This delayed pattern is worth watching for, specifically because it's so easy to misdiagnose in the moment it actually happens. Someone snaps unexpectedly at a minor inconvenience, a dropped dish, a small scheduling mix-up, something objectively too small to explain the intensity of the reaction. The instinct is usually to address the small thing directly, to focus on the dish or the schedule. But the far more useful question in these moments is simply what happened earlier, sometimes hours earlier, that never got a reaction at the time it was actually about. Following that thread backward often reveals the real source far more accurately than anything happening in the present moment ever could. The second sign is overcorrection. Genuine indifference doesn't need much defending. If you truly don't care about something, you don't usually feel compelled to prove how little you care repeatedly to anyone who listens. Performed indifference does exactly this. It shows up as someone bringing up, unprompted, multiple times, how little a breakup affected them, how unbothered they are by not getting the promotion, how completely fine they are with a friendship fading out. Real unconcern is quiet. Performed unconcern tends to be loud precisely because some part of the person doing it knows somewhere underneath that the performance needs reinforcing to hold. The same way any story told too many times starts to sound like it's trying to convince someone, including quite often the person telling it. The third sign is the eyes. This sounds almost too simple to matter, but it's remarkably reliable. Genuine indifference tends to come with steady, easy eye contact because there's nothing being managed, nothing being hidden. Performed indifference often comes with eye contact that breaks a beat too early, a glance that shifts away right as the sentence lands, as though some part of the body knows the face isn't fully cooperating with the story the mouth is telling. Once you start watching for this specific tell, it becomes remarkably hard to unsee. In conversations you'd never previously thought to examine this closely. Now here's the twist that reframes everything, because it's the part almost nobody expects walking into this conversation. Pretending not to care isn't actually a sign of emotional weakness, and it isn't a character flaw either. In a strange, backward way, it's often a sign of exactly how much something matters, filtered through a very specific, very old fear of what happens if that mattering becomes visible. Think about it from a different angle. Nobody bothers constructing an elaborate performance of indifference around something that genuinely doesn't matter to them. You don't see people going out of their way to prove they don't care about the weather in a city they've never visited. The performance only gets built around things that actually carry weight, which means the presence of the performance itself is, ironically, some of the strongest evidence available that real caring exists underneath it. This performance is found an especially efficient home in modern life, one worth naming directly. Social media has essentially built an entire infrastructure for broadcasting curated indifference to a wide audience at once. The carefully timed post right after a painful ending, the caption implying total unbothered peace, the photo chosen specifically because it shows a version of life that looks effortlessly fine. This isn't necessarily dishonest in some deliberate, calculated sense. Often the person posting genuinely wants to believe the caption as much as anyone reading it does. But the effort required to construct that specific image, the timing, the caption, the deliberate curation, is itself a form of evidence. Genuine indifference rarely requires an audience to confirm it. The need for witnesses to your unbothered state is usually a sign that the state itself hasn't fully settled yet. Let's talk about where this pattern connects to something researchers have studied closely, because it explains a great deal about why some people default to this strategy far more than others. It's called an avoidant attachment style, and it usually forms early in relationships with caregivers who are inconsistent in a very specific way, present but emotionally unavailable, responsive to physical needs but distant or dismissive around emotional ones. A child raised in that environment learns something efficient, if painful. Reaching out for comfort doesn't reliably produce comfort. Sometimes it produces nothing at all. And a nervous system that repeatedly reaches for something and receives nothing eventually stops reaching, not out of choice, but out of a kind of learned efficiency, and attempt to stop wasting energy on a request that rarely gets fulfilled. This is why people with this pattern often describe themselves, honestly, as simply not needing much from others, and in one sense they're telling the truth. The conscious experience really can feel like low need, but underneath that conscious experience, researchers have found something different happening physiologically. The same measures of stress, elevated heart rate, cortisol response, activation in threat-related regions of the brain that show up in people who are openly distressed also show up in people who report feeling completely fine, calm, unaffected. The body, in other words, often knows something the mind has been trained not to say out loud. There's a specific study design worth understanding here because it demonstrates this gap between conscious report and physiological response with real precision. Researchers studying attachment have repeatedly used a scenario involving brief separation and reunion, watching how people respond both in their self-reported feelings and in objective physiological measures at the same time. People with avoidant patterns consistently report feeling minimal distress during the separation and often describe the reunion itself as unremarkable, barely worth commenting on. Meanwhile, their heart rate, their skin conductance, their stress hormone levels tell a completely different story, one indistinguishable in many cases from participants who openly reported significant distress. This gap between what gets said and what the body actually does is the clearest scientific signature of the entire pattern this conversation has been describing. It isn't that these people are lying. It's that the part of them responsible for producing conscious, reportable feeling has become remarkably good at not registering what the rest of the system is clearly experiencing. This matters enormously for how you interpret someone in your own life who seems consistently unbothered by things that would visibly affect almost anyone else. Their calm may be entirely genuine at the level of conscious experience, while being entirely misleading about what's actually happening underneath. This isn't manipulation. It isn't even, in most cases, a conscious choice being made in the moment. It's the long-term result of a strategy built so early and practiced so consistently that it no longer requires deliberate effort to maintain. The wall built itself years ago. The person living behind it now simply experiences it as the normal shape of their own personality, rather than as a structure that was built brick by brick in response to something specific that happened to them. Let's talk about what this costs, because understanding the mechanism only matters if you understand what it's actually doing to the person running it. Day after day, year after year, the first cost is physiological, and it's more significant than most people realize. Psychologist James Gross has spent decades studying what happens when people suppress an emotional reaction rather than expressing or processing it. His research consistently shows that suppression doesn't actually reduce the internal experience of the emotion. It only reduces the outward display of it. Meanwhile, the physiological cost of that suppression, the effort required to keep a genuine reaction locked behind a calm exterior, tends to increase measurable stress in the body, elevated cardiovascular activity, greater sympathetic nervous system activation, exactly the opposite of what the performance is supposedly achieving. In other words, pretending not to care isn't actually calming. It's expensive, paid quietly, invisibly, every single time the mask goes up. The second cost is relational, and it's the one that tends to cause the most long-term pain. Relationships deepen through a specific process: vulnerability offered by one person, met with care rather than punishment, repeated enough times that trust slowly accumulates. Someone who has built their entire strategy around never letting that vulnerability show cannot easily participate in this process, no matter how much they might want closeness on some level. Partners, friends, even family members often describe a specific, confusing loneliness in relationships with people who perform indifference well, a sense of being close to someone while somehow never quite reaching them, like standing next to a door that never fully opens no matter how gently you knock. Over years, this specific kind of loneliness can quietly erode even relationships built on real love, simply because neither person ever gets the chance to be fully known by the other. The third cost is the hardest to see, because it happens entirely inside the person doing the performing. Over enough years, the line between performing indifference and genuinely losing touch with your own internal experience starts to blur. What began as a protective strategy, a conscious if automatic choice to hide feeling, can eventually calcify into something closer to real disconnection, where the person struggles not just to show what they feel, but to accurately identify what they're feeling in the first place. This is sometimes described in psychological literature as a kind of emotional numbing that develops gradually, unintentionally, as the side effect of years spent practicing suppression as the default response to nearly everything. Let's get specific about where this shows up most visibly, because seeing it in concrete situations makes the whole pattern far easier to recognize, both in others and in yourself. Early dating produces one of the most common and most self-defeating versions of this performance. Someone genuinely interested in a new person will often almost reflexively present the opposite impression, taking longer than they'd like to respond to a message, downplaying enthusiasm about a second date, mentioning offhandedly that they're not really looking for anything serious, even when a part of them very much is. This performance is usually driven by a specific old fear, the belief that visible enthusiasm makes a person less desirable, more vulnerable to rejection, easier to take advantage of. Ironically, this strategy often produces exactly the outcome it's trying to avoid. Genuine connection tends to require some visible investment from both people, and a relationship built entirely on two people performing detachment at each other rarely develops the depth either person is quietly hoping for underneath the performance. There's a specific irony worth naming here, because it explains why this strategy so often backfires in exactly the relationships where the stakes are highest. The person most committed to appearing unbothered is frequently the person who cares the most about how things turn out, precisely because the fear of rejection is proportional to how much the outcome actually matters to them. This means the people most likely to perform total indifference in early dating are often paradoxically the ones with the deepest capacity for real attachment once trust is actually established, a capacity that stays hidden behind the performance until enough safety accumulates for it to finally show itself. Breakups are one of the clearest stages for this performance, precisely because cultural scripts around breakups reward exactly this kind of masking. There's a specific social pressure to seem unaffected, to post the vacation photo a little too soon, to mention casually how much better things are now, all of it timed suspiciously close to the actual ending of the relationship. This performance often serves a function worth naming honestly. It protects status. There's an old sociological idea called the principle of least interest, which observes that in any relationship, whoever cares less holds more power. Appearing unaffected after a breakup isn't just about personal comfort. It's often, whether consciously or not, an attempt to hold on to power in a situation that otherwise feels like a total loss of it. Family grief carries a different version of this same performance, one shaped heavily by generational and cultural expectations about what strength is supposed to look like. Someone who learned early that composure equals strength may respond to a genuine loss, a parent's death, a divorce, a serious diagnosis, with a calm, almost eerie steadiness that gets praised by everyone around them as remarkable resilience. Sometimes that illness is genuine, a real healthy processing of grief happening at its own pace. But sometimes it's the exact performance we've been discussing offered, not because the grief isn't there, but because showing it feels somewhere deep down like it would be a burden, an inconvenience, or a sign of weakness in a family that never modeled any other way to grieve. This pattern often runs strongest in families where one generation experienced genuine hardship requiring real stoicism to survive, and passed that stoicism down as though it were a virtue independent of context rather than a response calibrated to a specific, difficult set of circumstances. A grandparent who lived through genuine deprivation may have needed composure simply to function day to day, and that composure, admirable in its original context, sometimes gets inherited by later generations as an unquestioned family value, applied indiscriminately to situations that no longer require the same survival-level stoicism, but still carry the same old expectation that visible grief is somehow excessive, self-indulgent, or a failure of character. Watching this pattern play out at a funeral is often instructive because it reveals the whole family system at once. One relative openly weeping, another sitting rigidly composed throughout the entire service, greeting condolences with a brief, practiced nod rather than any visible emotion. It's tempting to read the composed relative as simply handling the loss better. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes what's actually being witnessed is a person who learned decades earlier in that same family system that visible grief would be met with discomfort rather than support, and who has simply carried that lesson forward into what should be one of the moments most deserving of open, supported feeling in an entire human life. Workplaces produce their own specific version, one built around ambition and status rather than intimacy. The colleague who insists repeatedly that they don't care about the promotion that just went to someone else. The employee who shrugs off being passed over for a project, describing it as no big deal, while quietly reorganizing their entire sense of where they stand relative to their peers. Professional environments actively reward this performance because visible disappointment about career setbacks tends to be read unfairly but consistently as a lack of maturity, which means the incentive to perform unconcern here is reinforced constantly by an entire culture built around never appearing rattled. This particular version carries an additional layer worth naming because professional settings tend to punish visible emotional investment more harshly than almost any other domain of adult life. Someone who cries after a difficult performance review or who visibly shows frustration after losing out on an opportunity often faces real consequences to how seriously they're taken afterward, regardless of how reasonable their reaction actually was given the circumstances. This creates a specific powerful incentive to master the performance of unconcern early in a career, and that mastery, once built for professional survival, tends to bleed outward into personal relationships as well, because a skill practiced daily for years rarely stays neatly contained to the context it was originally built for. Friendships carry perhaps the quietest, least examined version of all. The friend who says, easily, that it's totally fine you couldn't make it to something important to them, when in reality the absence stung considerably more than they'd ever admit. The friend who lets a relationship slowly fade without ever naming the hurt out loud, choosing instead a slow, silent withdrawal dressed up as simply getting busy, because naming the actual hurt would require admitting the friendship mattered enough to be worth defending. Now let's address something crucial, because recognizing this pattern in someone you love creates its own specific challenge, one that requires real care to navigate well. If someone in your life performs indifference as their default strategy, the instinct to call it out directly, to say plainly, I know you actually care, rarely works the way you'd hope. Confronting the performance head-on often triggers exactly the defense it's designed to trigger, because you're threatening to remove the very shield that person has relied on for years, sometimes decades, to feel safe. Most people don't respond to having their armor pointed out by immediately setting it down. They respond by holding it tighter. What tends to work better is something slower and less direct. Consistency without demand, showing up repeatedly in ways that don't don't require the other person to drop their guard in order to receive care. Over time, enough consistent evidence that vulnerability doesn't get punished in this particular relationship can begin to soften the old pattern, not through confrontation, but through the accumulation of a different, safer experience than the one that originally built the defense. This requires real patience, more than most people are naturally inclined to offer, because the process is slow and often invisible from the outside. Someone who has spent 20 years learning that showing their real feelings led to punishment or dismissal isn't going to unlearn that lesson because you were kind to them once or even a dozen times. What actually shifts these patterns is a much longer accumulation of safety, enough repetitions of a different outcome that the old prediction, if I show this, it will go badly, finally starts to feel less certain than it once did. There's a specific mistake worth avoiding here, one that well-meaning people make constantly with someone they love who performs this pattern. It's the mistake of treating every small crack in the performance as an invitation to push harder, to say, "See, I knew you cared," the moment a brief flicker of real feeling shows through. This instinct is understandable, born from genuine care and a real desire to reach the person underneath the wall, but it tends to backfire precisely because it confirms the exact fear the performance was built to prevent, the fear that showing real feeling gets it examined, commented on, and used as evidence against the very defense that felt necessary in the first place. A more effective response, counterintuitive as it feels, is to let the crack simply exist without drawing attention to it, offering the same steady presence whether the wall is fully up or briefly, partially down. Over time, this teaches something the direct approach rarely manages to teach, that safety in this relationship doesn't depend on maintaining the performance at all. There's also something worth understanding about your own limits in this kind of relationship, because patience shouldn't be confused with unconditional tolerance for a dynamic that leaves you starved of the closeness you actually need. It's possible to hold real compassion for why someone learned to hide their feelings while also being honest with yourself about whether the relationship, as it currently exists, is meeting enough of your own needs to remain sustainable. Understanding the psychology behind a pattern explains where it came from. It doesn't obligate you to wait indefinitely for it to change, especially if the waiting is quietly costing you the depth of connection you're entitled to want for yourself. Now let's turn this toward the person listening who recognizes themselves in everything we've covered so far, because understanding the mechanism only matters if it leads somewhere useful for your own life. The first shift worth making is smaller than it might sound, and it's simply this. Start noticing the gap between what you say and what your body is doing in the moment you say it. The tightened shoulders, the shift in breathing, the urge to change the subject fast. This noticing doesn't require you to immediately change your behavior. It only requires you to become an honest witness to what's actually happening underneath the performance, because you cannot begin dismantling a pattern you haven't fully allowed yourself to see clearly first. The second shift involves practicing deliberately in low-stakes situations, letting a small amount of genuine reaction show, rather than immediately smoothing it over with the usual dismissal. This doesn't mean performing the opposite extreme, becoming someone who broadcasts every feeling loudly and immediately. It means something more modest and, in its own way, more difficult, allowing a brief moment of visible reaction to simply exist without rushing to cover it with a joke, a shrug, or a fast subject change. Practicing this in small, safe moments first, with people who have already shown you real safety, builds the exact muscle that years of suppression have left chronically underused. Consider starting somewhere almost embarrassingly small, a moment where a friend cancels plans and instead of your usual instant reassurance, you simply say, "Honestly, that's a bit disappointing actually," without immediately following it with a rushed explanation about how it's really no big deal at all. Notice what happens afterward. In most cases, with people who genuinely care about you, absolutely nothing bad happens. The friend apologizes or offers to reschedule or simply acknowledges what you said. The catastrophe your old pattern has been protecting you from for years typically fails to materialize, and each time it fails to materialize, the old prediction weakens just slightly, making the next small moment of honesty a bit bit easier to offer than the one before it. The third shift is more internal, and it involves questioning a belief that likely feels so obvious it's never actually been examined. The belief that needing something from someone else or being visibly affected by something makes you weaker or more of a burden or less worthy of respect. This belief was probably formed in a specific environment, at a specific age, in response to specific people who genuinely did treat visible feeling as a liability. It's worth asking honestly whether that belief is still accurate in your current life with your current relationships, or whether it's simply an old rule correctly applied once that never got updated for the different, safer world you're actually living in now. It can help to make this question concrete rather than abstract. Think of one specific person currently in your life, someone who has, across many interactions, shown genuine care and consistency. Ask yourself directly whether this specific person, based on actual evidence rather than old fear, would actually punish you for showing them that something mattered. In most cases, when the question is asked this specifically, rather than left as a vague, generalized dread, the honest answer becomes far clearer than the old, blanket assumption ever allowed it to be. Here's something worth sitting with because it reframes the entire fear underneath this whole pattern. The people who actually deserve closeness with you were never going to punish you for caring. The people who did punish you for it, back when the pattern first formed, were showing you something true about themselves, not something true about the wisdom of caring in general. Generalizing their specific failure into a permanent rule about all future relationships was a reasonable mistake to make as a child trying to survive a specific environment. It's not, however, an accurate map of every relationship you'll ever have as an adult, and continuing to apply it indiscriminately costs you access to exactly the kind of closeness you were originally trying to protect. Let's talk honestly about what real strength actually looks like here, because the entire performance of not caring was originally built on a mistaken belief about where strength comes from. Real strength was never the absence of visible feeling. It's the willingness to let something matter out loud in front of someone without immediately needing to control how they respond to that information. This is harder by a significant margin than simply looking unaffected. Anyone can build a wall. Very few people can stand in front of someone else feeling something real and let it be seen without flinching away from the exposure that creates. This reframing matters because it flips the entire hierarchy most people carry without questioning it. The version of you that seems unbothered, easy, low maintenance, immune to disappointment was never actually the strong one. That version was managing risk, understandably, given whatever taught it to manage risk that way in the first place. The version capable of saying plainly that actually hurt, or I was really looking forward to that, or I've missed you, without immediately following it with a joke to soften the exposure. That version is doing something genuinely difficult, something that takes far more courage than maintaining a practiced, comfortable distance ever required. Consider how this plays out in a specific, ordinary moment worth imagining clearly. Two people receive the exact same disappointing news: a cancelled plan, a missed opportunity, a friend forgetting something that mattered. One responds with practiced ease, a quick shrug, an immediate assurance that it's genuinely fine, moving the conversation along before anyone has time to sit with what actually happened. The other pauses briefly and says, honestly, that actually stings a bit, before continuing on with the conversation just the same. From the outside, the first person often gets read as more composed, more resilient, easier to be around, but it's worth asking which of these two people is actually demonstrating more control over their own experience. The first is avoiding an internal reality. The second is naming it accurately and continuing to function anyway, which is a far more precise definition of resilience than simply appearing untouched by whatever just happened. There's a final piece of this worth naming clearly, because it's the piece that actually makes change possible rather than just understandable. Unlearning this pattern doesn't happen through a single dramatic moment of vulnerability, some big cathartic conversation where everything finally gets said all at once. It happens the way most deep patterns change, slowly through small repeated moments where a different choice gets made instead of the automatic one, where the joke doesn't come quite as fast, where the subject doesn't get changed quite so quickly, where the sentence gets to end mind without an escape hatch built into it. Expect this to feel wrong at first. Expect the old instinct to feel far more natural than the new one, because it's had years, sometimes decades of practice on its side. That discomfort isn't proof you're doing something wrong. It's simply what it feels like to interrupt a pattern that's been running on autopilot for most of your life, and interrupting autopilot is supposed to feel strange before it starts feeling normal. Here's the insight worth carrying forward from everything we've covered today. Pretending not to care was never actually protecting you from the pain of caring. The pain was always there, underneath the performance, paid quietly in stress, in distance, in a particular kind of loneliness that comes from never quite letting anyone see you clearly. All the performance ever really did was add isolation on top of pain that already existed, a second cost stacked on top of the first, without ever actually removing the original one. It's worth being honest that unlearning this pattern rarely happens in a straight line. There will be moments even after real progress where the old instinct wins anyway, where the joke comes out before you can stop it, where the subject gets changed a beat too fast, where you catch yourself hours later, wondering why you couldn't just say the true thing when it actually mattered. This is an evidence that nothing has changed. Deeply grooved patterns, built over years and reinforced by real experiences of pain, don't dissolve the moment you understand them intellectually. They loosen slowly, unevenly through repeated practice, through noticing the old habit a little earlier each time, through gradually collecting enough evidence that the people currently in your life respond to honesty very differently than the people who first taught you to hide it. There's a specific kind of relief waiting on the other side of this practice, one that's easy to underestimate until you've actually experienced it firsthand. It's the relief of finally being known accurately by at least a few people, rather than being liked or respected for a carefully maintained performance that never quite let anyone reach the actual person underneath it. That relief tends to arrive quietly in an ordinary moment, when you say something true and vulnerable, and the person across from you simply receives it without punishment, without mockery, without anything at all except the specific, steady warmth of being taken seriously. That moment, small as it might seem from the outside, is usually enough to make the entire uncomfortable process of unlearning feel worth every bit of discomfort it required to get there. You are allowed to care the whole time. You still are. The people worth keeping close were never going to make you regret it, and the ones who once did were never actually the standard everyone else should be measured against. Let it matter, out loud sometimes, to the people who've actually earned that honesty. The mask was never protecting you from anything real. It was only ever protecting you from being fully seen, and being fully seen, it turns out, was the thing you wanted most this entire time, underneath every careful practice shrug. There's nothing left to prove by staying unreachable. The performance served its purpose once, in an environment that genuinely required it. That environment is gone now. Even if the habit built to survive it hasn't fully caught up to that fact yet, let it catch up slowly, one honest moment at a time, with the people who've already shown you it's finally safe to stop performing at all.